So we are very pleased to be here today with Brenda Davis, a registered dietitian and an internationally acclaimed speaker and leader in the field of plant-based nutrition. Now, Brenda has worked as a public health nutritionist, a clinical nutrition specialist, a nutrition consultant, and an academic nutrition instructor. She is the lead dietitian in a diabetes research project in the Marshall Islands, which we'll be talking about today. And she's also authored and co-authored several articles for peer-reviewed medical and nutrition journals and magazines. On top of that, she's a featured speaker at nutrition, medical, and health conferences all around the world. She's also the co-author of 9 award-winning best-selling books with over 750,000 copies in print, including Becoming Vegan, both the comprehensive and express editions, Becoming Raw, Becoming Vegetarian, and Defeating Diabetes. And she's also in the process of writing 2 more books specifically about diabetes, in which she describes the effect of oil-free, sugar-free, flour-free, plant-based nutrition, and provides a collection of delicious recipes as well. So thank you so much for being here today with us, Brenda.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Absolutely. I always love talking with you. I think of you as the sort of encyclopedia of nutrition information, almost like a human Google of sorts. So you got a lot of really cool information. So today we're going to be talking about a lot of topics: insulin resistance, inflammation, oxidative stress, dysbiosis, which are all sort of complicated topics that Brenda can very clearly lay out and clear up the confusion about. But before we get there, you told us that you just returned from the Marshall Islands, where you've done some really cool, extensive diabetes research with the Marshallese. So can you give us a little insight into what work you're doing there and what have you learned from that population?
Yeah, well, for people that don't know, the Marshall Islands are about halfway between Hawaii and Australia in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and they're very remote, and it's a very small population, about 60,000 people, about half of which live on the main island, which is Majuro, and about 15,000 on a smaller island called the Ibai. And these islands have a very little land space. So the big one is 3.7 square miles in area, and the little one is 0.14 square miles. So very tiny little islands. And so the amount of food that they produce is really not adequate for the number of people that live there. So they have to import a lot of food. These islands, you know, the big one might be able to sustain 800 people or 1,000 people. I'm not sure, but definitely not 30,000. So they import a lot of foods, and because people are poor, they import a lot of processed foods and cheap meat. And so the Marshall Islands has one of the highest rates of diabetes in the world. And the estimates go from some 21 or so percent of the adult population to about 37% of the adult population, depending on where you do your little survey. And so it's a very significant problem, and about half of the surgeries on the island are amputations due to diabetes. And there's no dialysis available, so if your kidneys fail, you're moved to Hawaii or die. So it's a very serious situation. We started in 2006 doing a research study where we compared the effects of a very high fiber plant-rich diet or plant-based diet with and exercise and all of the lifestyle changes with the usual treatment for diabetes. And we saw average blood sugar drops within 2 weeks of about 75 points. And, all of the ailments people complained about, like stiffness and painful legs and fuzzy heads and all of that, started to disappear quite rapidly. So we did research for about a year. And since that time, I've been going back to continue with trying to influence the direction that the country's going and just do more diabetes interventions. And this time going back, I did something quite different that I've never done before. But I was asked to go back to write a curriculum for nutrition for grades kindergarten to 6, and to do in-services for all of the teachers and principals in the public schools in the Marshall Islands, so going to each school individually. So wrote a friend of mine and I, a friend who's a speech pathologist and a specialist with communication in children, helped me out, and we developed a curriculum and all of the activities for the children, and then trained the teachers. And it was it was really quite a wonderful adventure, and the teachers responded so favorably. They are excited about starting to teach the children about nutrition. And we had one lady say to us when we were providing samples of how to prepare beans, and most of them have never eaten beans in their life. Wow, this is better than ice cream. So we had a lot of fun with them, and I really think we are having quite an impact there.
That's amazing. I mean, I've been hearing about your work in the Marshall Islands for many years now, and it's really powerful example of what's possible. So let's get into a little bit of the science here. Can you tell us what is insulin resistance and what causes it?
Well, insulin resistance, a lot of people, when they think about diabetes, and even when you think about how mainstream sort of medicine treats diabetes, generally what we're trying to do is control blood sugars. And so all of our focus is on, making sure that you don't get these highs and lows in blood sugars. And I think that we're missing the boat, because what it's really all about is looking at the causes of those high blood sugars, or the reasons why people have consistently elevated blood sugars. And when you start to look at it, what you recognize is that with type 2 diabetes in particular, of course type 1 is very different, but with type 2, it's really a disease of insulin resistance. So in most cases, the pancreas is putting out plenty of insulin. There's no problem there. And as a matter of fact, in the earlier stages, people are hyperinsulinemic, so they're actually producing a lot of insulin. But for some reason, that insulin isn't doing its job. And of course, the job that insulin needs to do is to sort of, serve as the key that opens the door of the cell, which basically sends signals to open this door to let sugar in, so that it can be used for energy by the body. And when insulin doesn't do its job, of course, sugar levels just rise, and you end up, losing sugar in your urine and so forth. And so to me, what makes more sense than just trying to control blood sugar? Of course, we need to control blood sugar, but what we really need to do is look at why are people getting insulin resistance, and can it be overcome? Is there anything we can do to reverse insulin resistance? Can we restore insulin sensitivity? Because if we can do that, of course, we can defeat the disease, and that's really what it's all about.
This is great. So you're an expert on lipotoxicity as well. So lipotoxicity is just a complicated super nerd way of referring to fat overload, which can contribute to insulin resistance and diabetes. So could you educate our listeners a little bit about what is the relationship between lipotoxicity and diabetes, and how does insulin resistance get affected by that?
Yeah, and I'm definitely not an expert on lipotoxicity, but I've learned a little bit about it, and it's just fascinating, absolutely fascinating. So to put it in a nutshell, in a very understandable way, our bodies have these incredible cells that can store almost unlimited amounts of fat. They're called adipocytes. And so that's normally when you eat too much and turn it into fat, your body just stores it as fat in your fat tissue. But what happens when your body, you eat, that sort of overload continues and continues and continues. Sometimes it's too much for your body to handle, and it just can't shuttle it all to the adipocytes fast enough, and you end up with a sort of a buildup of fat in your liver, and it ends up getting stored in places that are not meant to be fat storage houses. So lipotoxicity is essentially fat being stored in tissues that were not meant to store fat. And so you're looking at fat being stored in the liver, which is absolutely a disaster to health, because when fat gets stored in liver, it creates insulin resistance. Your liver actually ends up shuttling some fat to the pancreas, and even 1% fat in your pancreas can actually destroy or put to sleep our beta cells. So the production of insulin can get compromised. And then some of that fat gets shuttled to other vital organs or even to muscle tissue. Now, muscle tissue has these little storage organs for fat called intramyocellular lipids. And these, in athletes, they're actually quite high because you need a little bit of extra lipid stored in your muscles when you're an athlete and you're using a lot of energy. Those can come in very handy. But what happens in the case of diabetes is you get these intramyocellular lipid little organelles malfunction, and you get too many of them. And what they do is they can actually interfere with the intracellular kind of signaling. What the insulin will signal to open the gates to let sugar in, it interferes with that signaling, so you become insulin resistant when you have not only a lot of these, but these organs with the wrong types of these little organelles end up with the wrong types of fat in them. So then they really misfire. And so fat in all of those places where fat really should not be is a huge contributor to insulin resistance.
Yeah, I'm actually really glad to hear you say this, because what we do in our coaching program and what we do in all of our webinars is I literally make people, I'm like, get out a pen and get out a piece of paper and write this down. Insulin resistance is caused by the storage of fat in tissues that are not designed to store fat, which is exactly what you just said.
Absolutely.
So it's really
absolutely. Yeah. And one of the things, I don't know, have you looked at Roy Taylor's work?
I have.
So this is really interesting stuff, because Roy Taylor and his team, I think they're out of the UK. He did the Banting Best lecture in 2012, and he's featured in Diabetes Care. I think the article of the year or whatever. There's a lot of really important research from their team, but they were the ones that showed that if you do bariatric surgery on a person, within a week, their diabetes starts to reverse. And it's, you cannot get intramyocellular lipids down in that amount of time. So they said, what's going on here? And what's going on is you get within a week a 30% reduction in liver, fatty liver. It's a non-alcoholic fatty liver. And 30% reduction in non-alcoholic liver is enough to restore insulin sensitivity. So it's really quite remarkable. And so a lot of this research is very, so what they did is they said, okay, bariatric surgery does it. What about if we put people on a 600 calorie or 800 calorie diet, did the very, very same thing? And their research suggests that it's really about a non-alcoholic fatty liver and the fat in the pancreas. And as soon as you can get that down, you can actually do amazing things to restore insulin sensitivity, even before intramyocellular lipids are reduced. So it's really quite interesting.
That's absolutely fascinating. Can you explain how insulin resistance is influenced by inflammation? And more importantly, where does inflammation occur?
Yeah, so inflammation, when you think about inflammation, you think about, the word flame. It's when you get a cut on your skin and it gets all red and what we call inflamed. And that's what we think, most people think of inflammation. But we can get a sort of low-grade inflammation in the tissues inside our bodies. And we have various ways of measuring this, like C-reactive protein and these kinds of measures that give us an indication. But this low grade of inflammation is it actually increases insulin resistance in our tissues. And what happens is insulin resistance itself also causes inflammation. So it's like a vicious cycle. But what the triggers here, and when we talk about all of these sort of drivers of insulin resistance, the main causes, the things that drive insulin resistance are excess body fat, inactivity, so insufficient activity, and an unhealthy diet, so eating the wrong kinds of foods. And these all drive lipotoxicity and inflammation and oxidative stress and dysbiosis and all of these things. But when we look at inflammation, what we see is when you end up with too much body fat, especially visceral body fat. And when I say visceral fat, as compared to subcutaneous fat, visceral fat is the fat in and around your organs. It's in your sort of abdominal area. Often the big hard bellies people with big hard bellies have a lot of visceral fat, as compared to subcutaneous fat, which is near the surface of the skin. And so the visceral fat, one of the disadvantages of having a lot of visceral fat is when you have visceral fat, you get these chemicals that are produced from the visceral fat called cytokines, and the cytokines or more specifically adipokines from fat tissue produces adipokines, and these chemicals are actually highly inflammatory. So it's that's what ends up increasing inflammation throughout your body, is just that excess fat being stored, especially around your vital organs. And inflammation is related to not just diabetes, heart disease and atherosclerosis, and all of these chronic diseases, of course, arthritis and autoimmune diseases, and so having excess body fat contributes to inflammation in a very, very powerful way.
So are there any routine blood tests that an individual can take they can get labs taken that basically will tell them how inflamed they are, for whether they're
just the high sensitivity CRP is probably the most standard one that I know of, and I'm not a physician, but I certainly that's the one that I think is probably the least expensive and the most commonly done. So either a CRP or an HS, high sensitivity CRP.
Got it. Fantastic. Okay, so can you go a little bit into oxidative stress now? And tell us what exactly is oxidative stress and how does that promote insulin resistance itself?
Yeah, so oxidative stress is, it's kind of tricky for people to understand, and so I'll explain a little bit in a way that I think makes it a little simpler. So oxidative stress is kind of an imbalance between what we call pro-oxidants and antioxidants. And so what pro-oxidants are things like free radicals are pro-oxidants, and free radicals, they are unstable molecules, unstable electrons, and they're unstable because they're missing an electron. And so they're like these little monsters that go around trying to steal, they're little thieves trying to steal an electron from another molecule. And as soon as they succeed in that task, they turn the other molecule into an unstable molecule or a free radical. And it's like a chain reaction of destruction. So you get this one free radical becomes stable, and it causes another free radical, and it steals another to become stable, but it just goes on and on and on. And an antioxidant is like the hero that comes in and says to the free radical, would you like an electron? Here, I will give you one. But for some reason, the antioxidant doesn't become a free radical, it remains stable. And so it can stop that chain reaction of destruction by offering an electron yet remaining stable. And so that's kind of, and so when you end up with a situation where you've got an excess of pro-oxidants and an insufficient amount of antioxidants, you get oxidative stress. And oxidative stress is a bad news because it increases insulin resistance, and if you think about, well, what's going on, what causes what causes oxidative stress, we're thinking about things like the pro-oxidants, like heme iron in meat is a pro-oxidant. One of the things that I often think about is when you eat too much sugar, for example, you end up with a lot of when you have high blood sugar, really on a chronic basis, your blood sugars are elevated, even if you're not if you don't have diabetes yet, but in the pre-diabetic range, you end up with glycation and advanced glycation end products forming in your body. And these compounds are absolutely, they cause damage in multiple ways to your eyes and your blood vessels, and they increase insulin resistance because they make your cells work less efficiently. And so oxidative stress is, it's all part of it. Eating fat that becomes oxidized, fat can become oxidized very easily, especially if it's rancid, or and it can contribute to oxidative stress as well. So these are things that are easily taken care of by eating fewer of the foods that are known pro-oxidants, and by really boosting antioxidants in your diet. And the main sources of antioxidants are fruits and vegetables. We have antioxidants in beans and even in whole grains and nuts and seeds. But whole plant foods are the primary sources of antioxidants. So as you boost those foods, you reduce oxidative stress. And it's interesting that there are the studies that have been done looking at CRP levels in vegans, for example, versus omnivores, even omnivorous athletes who are health conscious, is really quite significant. So there are two studies I know of. One that was done in 2007 in the United States, that compared endurance athletes and Western eaters and vegans. And the vegans had the lowest CRPs, I think it was 0.57 or 0.55 versus 0.75 for the athletes, and 2.5 or some such number for the omnivores, or the people eating a standard Western diet. And then the other one just came out in 2017 from Brazil. And again, the vegans were 0.55 or something like that, versus the non-vegetarians that were about double that number. So definitely vegans or people eating a whole food plant-based diet are going to be getting naturally more antioxidants than would people eating an omnivorous diet.
I think I know the exact study that you're talking about, the first one you're talking about, in which they compared raw vegans who were actually eating a slightly higher fat intake. I think they had something like 40% of their total calories coming.
That's right. Yeah, you're thinking of the right study, Fontana. Yeah.
Exactly, right. And then they compared them to the marathon runners. But now the trick is that these marathon runners, they ran an average, I think it was 49 miles per week for 19 years. I mean, these are
they were athletes,
accomplished athletes, right?
Very accomplished athletes, absolutely.
Right. So you would think that, oh, okay, well, if you're running that much, then it doesn't really matter what you eat, right? But what you're saying is that no, and in fact, the vegans who weren't really exercising had better metabolic health than the runners.
Yeah, absolutely, and which is fascinating to people. Exercise is so critical. It's so important, but exercise does not trump a bad diet necessarily. And I know too many people that have had heart attacks who are endurance athletes, and their diet's been terrible, and they thought just doing the exercise and staying reasonably lean would protect them, but it will not necessarily do so.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's talk about dysbiosis now, which is basically an altered gut microbiome.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about the connection between how your microbiome, the health of your microbiome, and insulin resistance and diabetes?
Yeah, and it's surprising to people. They think, well, how could the bacteria in my gut affect diabetes? But the bacteria in your gut affect everything. You have, I think it's 10 times more bacteria in your gut than cells in your body. And this is it's a hugely important contributor to health, and not, like I say, not just diabetes, heart disease, dementia, everything you can think of. This microbiome needs to be healthy, and dysbiosis is essentially again an imbalance between the good bacteria and the not so friendly bacteria, and then the not so friendly bacteria have overtaken. And so this is what dysbiosis is all about. And the way that dysbiosis affects insulin resistance is, I mean, there are a few different mechanisms, but one is that when you have dysbiosis, you end up often with a leaky gut, and a leaky gut allows intact proteins to get out into your bloodstream and causes inflammation. And of course, we know inflammation increases insulin resistance. And then the second thing that can happen is a dysbiosis actually increases the release of inflammatory cytokines again. So that, again, it's through inflammation, but a little different mechanism. And then the third is called metabolic endotoxemia. And maybe people haven't heard of endotoxemia, but basically there are certain types of bacteria, these gram-negative bacteria in our gut, that when they die and break down, the breakdown products release these things called endotoxins that are associated with increased insulin resistance. And so there are a number of mechanisms by which dysbiosis can increase insulin resistance. So, how do we deal with it? Well, we want to make sure that our diets are promoting healthy gut bacteria, and that means you need to be eating your fiber, and you need to be eating, preferably a lot of prebiotics, which are the food for your gut bacteria. You want to feed them well, and what gives you prebiotics? Of course, high fiber foods, and then of course you want to be consuming some probiotics if you can as well. You can consume some fermented vegetables. You can consume some yogurts that are non-dairy yogurts, like almond yogurt or something like that. There, miso, things like that can be sources of probiotics, or you can take probiotic capsules. One of the things I'm making right now is for Christmas is a vegan cashew cheese, which is just fermented blended cashews and water. It's pretty simple. So those are ways of increasing your intake of probiotics.
So if somebody's microbiome has been severely damaged, in general, how long does it take to restore that?
To be honest, I think it really depends on the individual, how good their protocol is, and how serious the damage is. So I really am not, I hate to even throw out a ballpark figure, but my guess would be that it would take 2 or 3 months to get the gut health restored. If you're interviewing Michael Clapper, he's the guy. He deals with leaky gut a lot, so I think he could give a better answer than I could on that one.
All right, we'll definitely have to ask him that question for sure.
Yeah.
So some of our speakers have actually gone into a little bit of detail about the detrimental effects of antibiotic use, because they can actually, the broad spectrum antibiotics can actually kill both pathogenic bacteria as well as beneficial bacteria. So,
of course, yeah, it wipes you out.
Detail about, what's the problem with antibiotics, and if you have been taking antibiotics throughout the course of your life or sometime in the recent past, what can you do about that to restore your gut back to a normal operating?
It's so tough, and honestly, this is not really my area of expertise, but I think that while you're taking antibiotics, if you have to, there are times when you have to take antibiotics, but if you have to take them, take the probiotics at the same time. Take them for a couple of weeks at least afterwards, and certainly a complete sort of protocol that would last a couple of months of taking a really high quality probiotic would make a lot of sense. So you want the best probiotic you can find with a broad spectrum, not just a single strain, but a broad spectrum strain of antibiotics would make a lot of sense to me. And then, of course, at the same time, making sure you're eating a lot of prebiotics, a lot of fiber, and gradually reintroducing. And I know for some people who have very, very challenging time, they can look at, fecal transplants and these kinds of more hardcore treatments for dysbiosis.
Wonderful. Okay, so let's switch gears here to some practical applications. So you have a lot of experience with this. What are some key dietary strategies that you would suggest for
Okay.
someone living with type 2 diabetes, trying to reverse it, and someone living with type 1, trying to improve their quality of life?
Yeah. So I would say number one, make whole plant foods the foundation of your diet. So you want at least 10 to 12 servings of vegetables and fruits a day, if not more. 14, 16, 18. Make the bulk of your diet whole, colorful whole plant foods. Why? Fiber. We need to be getting, I would say, a minimum of 40 to 50 grams a day, and preferably 70 or 80. I mean, we want a lot of healthy fiber. And you want not just, sprinkling bran on your food. You don't want to be doing that. You want to be getting the whole spectrum of different types of fiber, the soluble fiber or the viscous fiber versus sort of insoluble or non-viscous. The more soluble or viscous fiber helps more with blood glucose control and blood cholesterol control as well. So you want to start there, and legumes as your primary protein source, very important. I would say you want to make sure when you're choosing foods also within categories. So you're looking at vegetables, fruits, legumes, whole grains, nuts, and seeds. But within each of those groups, you can also look at the glycemic load of the food you're eating to some extent. And so, for example, millet has a much higher glycemic index and load than would barley. And so you can do those kinds of comparisons. Looking at one of the things that I often talk about is well, let's talk about carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are, a lot of people think carbohydrates are bad for people with diabetes, but the reality is that when carbohydrates are packaged in whole foods with fiber and phytochemicals and antioxidants and all of these powerful compounds, they are consistently protective, and they help to prevent and control diabetes. And so it's not that we want to reduce our intake of carbohydrates, it's that we want to reduce our intake of carbohydrates that have had everything of value to human health removed before we eat them. And that's where we get things wrong, because all of these carbohydrate naysayers, well, we have to understand 90% of the carbohydrates that people eat have been refined. We've removed everything of value before we, not only have we removed everything of value, we've added a bunch of crap to them before we eat them. So we take away the fiber and the phytochemicals and the antioxidants and all of these good things, and we add fat and sugar and salt and artificial colors and flavors, and then we eat them, and we wonder why things are going wrong. Well, it's really a no-brainer. So those kinds of carbohydrates are consistently associated with increased risk of diabetes and other chronic diseases as well. So what we want to do is we want to make sure our carbohydrates are in the whole food form, and it's hard to go wrong when you do that. So where fruits and vegetables are concerned, just enjoy. You can eat fruits and vegetables pretty much to your heart's content. I would say for people with diabetes, sometimes you need to be, especially in the early stages where they can be very carbohydrate sensitive, you need to be a little more cautious with the very concentrated sources. So the starchy vegetables and the whole grains, you would want maybe to control portion sizes until so that you can get the weight loss achieved. But non-starchy vegetables and fruits you can eat more liberally, and then when you think about whole grains, for example, one of the things that I say about whole grains is I've created this thing called the whole grain hierarchy, and the whole grain hierarchy is to help people understand that even whole grains, even within that category of whole grains, there are various levels of processing these whole grains. And so at the top of the whole grain hierarchy would be intact whole grains. They're grains as you pick them off the plant. At the very top would be sprouted intact whole grains. So sprouted kamut berries or sprouted quinoa or something like that. Then the next level would be the intact grains that are cooked, and then the cut whole grains. So when you cut the whole grains to produce something like steel cut oats or bulgur or something like that, these are still healthy foods, but the surface area has been increased. They're exposed to more oxygen. So basically you're increasing the rate of absorption a little bit. The next level would be rolled whole grains. And the thickness of the roll matters. So a very thick rolled oat might have a glycemic index of 45 or 50. The thinner you get it, the higher the glycemic index will go. Very thin, quick cooking oats might have a glycemic index of 70 or 74 or something like that. So it's a really big difference. And then the next level down from there would be the shredded grains, like shredded wheat, and then would be the ground grains. When you grind a grain, you're increasing the surface area a lot. So that grain's going to be absorbed very quickly. So even if you compare white bread with brown or whole wheat bread, the glycemic index of the white bread might be 75 and the glycemic index of the brown might be 74. Just slightly lower because you've ground the grains and they still get very rapidly absorbed into the bloodstream. And then the next would be flaked grains. And then at the bottom of the barrel, you have puffed grains. And puffed grains you literally are putting them under 1,500 pounds of pressure, and they're very light and fluffy. They just dissolve in the bloodstream, and they have a very high glycemic impact. And so not only are you affecting the glycemic impacts as you go down the whole grain hierarchy, but you're actually destroying nutrients as you go down the whole grain hierarchy. So fewer nutrients, more products of oxidation, and a higher impact on blood sugar.
So that's really interesting, actually, because it sounds like as you go down the whole grain hierarchy, you're basically increasing surface area at every step. Right? First
absolutely.
And then you roll it, and then you grind it, and at every point you're getting more and more and more surface area. So the more surface area there is, the more rapidly they get absorbed, the higher the impact on your blood glucose, right?
Absolutely. And it's not, 100%, but essentially, basically, that's the direction. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. So you have, speaking of trying to get away from, processed grains and other processed components of our diet, you have a couple of upcoming books coming out. Can you tell us a little bit about these books and why you decided to write them in the first place?
Yeah, so I wrote a book called Defeating Diabetes in 2003. And of course, we've learned a lot since then. And so I wanted to write another diabetes book that was a little simpler for people who are who are really wanting to know what to do. And so talked to my publisher, and they said, well, how about doing two books? We need a cookbook and we need the information book. So we're doing two books. The first is going to be the cookbook. And the cookbook will be, the goal was to do oil-free, sugar-free, flour-free, very whole food, plant-based recipes, but also recipes that were simple. And that people who are, in their 70s, it's a man living on his own, that they could pick up the book and everything's in one pot. You're cooking it quickly, or you're, doing a salad that's just really simple, some really simple dressing recipes. And so we're really going for tasty, simple, but very therapeutically effective recipes.
That's great. Okay, so you've worked with a lot of people over the years. You have a lot of experience, large groups of people. What is the number one challenge that you see people face when it comes to making lifestyle change, and how do you help them overcome that?
Oh, wow, that is, it's so tough because our food is not just, we don't just eat to live. It's about our entire social network. It's about family. It's about celebration. So I think, I really believe that people would shift much more easily if everyone around them was going in this direction, because I think a lot of people would sooner die than be separated from their tribe. Honestly, that is a fundamental requirement for life for many people, is to belong. And so when you're doing things differently food wise, and you're excluded from your group, you no longer belong. So one of the things that I do is I try to get their tribe interested, get them to, at any lectures, to bring their families, to help them to understand why this kind of shift would be so valuable for them. And then the other thing is to get them to have another tribe, not to leave their current tribe, but to have another group of friends that's eating the way they are. So even if you do things with the group that isn't eating like you, and you enjoy golfing with them, or skiing with them, or hiking with them, or biking with them, that's fine. But then you've got this group of people that you're really comfortable eating with, and who get what you're doing. And so I think that setting up that kind of support system is absolutely essential. So even with a program like CHIP, or any of these sort of lifestyle programs, they often have alumni groups, and they continue to educate, and they continue to bring people who are like-minded together. And to me, that's just critical. And then the second thing is to learn to prepare these foods well. So just if you can take a cooking class, get some good books. It's just so important that we get comfortable with using a variety of colorful whole plant foods. And it's just a prerequisite. You've got to be able to do that. And there are really simple tricks you can do to accomplish that task. So it's just a matter of learning the basics. And most people can get by with 5 or 6 or 7 decent dinner recipes, and always having a big salad in the fridge that you can pull out, and a great dressing. And you can make a full meal out of a salad so easily. I add, like at lunch, I'll tell you what I had for lunch. I had a beautiful green salad that had all different colorful vegetables. And I had a hemp seed dressing that I made with lemon and so forth. But then I added, as a sort of to make it provide some calories, I added persimmon, and I added some kamut berries, and I added some pumpkin seeds, and I was good to go. So it's really simple. It can be little cubes of steamed yams or butternut squash, but something to give it some substance, and some sprouted quinoa, whatever it is that'll give you some calories.
This is awesome. For those of you who may, have not heard from Brenda before, not be familiar with any of her books, when Brenda decides to write a book, she does not mess around. I was telling her before this interview that I started reading Becoming Vegan last year, and it has become a Bible for me. And now I've been in this world for 15 years, but I'm reading this book, and it's just like nugget after nugget after nugget. So, Brenda, I'm excited for your book, and I hope that our listeners are also going to get your book when it comes out.
Well, thank you so much, Cyrus. I'm honored that you are finding Becoming Vegan, the comprehensive edition, so valuable. We put our hearts and souls into that book, just wanting people to get this right, because everyone who goes plant-based who gets it wrong becomes exhibit number 1 for why we should be eating meat. So we just really want people to do it well. And even for people with diabetes, I mentioned about fiber and carbohydrates and protein, with beans and so forth, but getting the nutrients you need is critical. Vitamin B12 and vitamin D and the omega-3 fatty acids and those things. And so that's really why we've written these books, to help people get these things right.
Thank you so much for being here with us today, Brenda. We really appreciate all of your time. And
thank you.
I hope that our listeners actually learned a lot from you today, because I always do. And
your
source of knowledge is just unending.
Well, thank you so much. And it really is an honor and a privilege for me to be with you guys. I just am in awe of the number of people you're you're influencing and helping. And I'm so grateful for what you're doing. You guys rock. Thank you so much.